And with that intro, I can tell you I still have not watched the new season of Cosmos. This is Mars on Life. I'm your host, Ryan Mancini, and joined with me as always,
Sebastian Shug.
Ooh.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, the boys are back. We had a pretty lengthy discussion last week about...
Oh, is that the term we're using?
The War of the Stars. Yeah, lengthy.
I think we just kind of want to touch on a few more things just to kind of bury the hatchet, even though it's not going to be buried completely.
Oh, no.
You wanted to delve into it more so if you want to give any final thoughts or...
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts that I felt were important in terms of, and we haven't yet received any feedback from any listeners as to why we felt the way we did, why I may like The Last Jedi but then not like Rise of Skywalker, my thoughts on the prequels, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't received those yet. However, I can already predict that these would be questions that I would get, which would be, for example, why I would rather be a casual fan and why I feel like it's not fun anymore. And I know this is something that other Star Wars fans have felt. I know, notably, Christian Harloff from Schmoes Know, he kind of feels this way, which is that a part of it is the fandom and a part of it is just it's not as fun when it's become such a divisive topic. Mm-hmm. And, I see that and I feel that. And for me, as somebody who for so many years was bullied because I liked Star Wars, to then see Star Wars fans
essentially get bullied.
What's the line Obi-Wan says? You've become the very thing you swore to destroy.
To destroy, yeah. I think, and this, I could just be totally wrong here when I say this, but it is in part due to growing up. You no longer look at these films in an idyllic light, more so as if you just want to watch a movie, and in turn, a good movie, which hasn't been all of them. If not a grandstanding majority. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think your point is invalid to make the switch.
Yeah,
it's definitely if you've seen the overreactive, statements, opinions, and just people who are just in the mindset of this is what I eat, sleep, and breathe. Star Wars. I think that. We could all universally agree that it's not worth one's time to do. It's not worth one's effort.
And some of it too, after The Last Jedi came out, at some point I was telling people that there's two things that divide Americans. There's the presidency, the election and presidency of Donald Trump, and then there's Star Wars: The Last Jedi. And those really are two things that, I can speak for myself when I say I've been.
You can't believe that they're existing at the same time.
And that's the interesting thing is, when Force Awakens came out, it was the pre-Trump Star Wars. It was the last pre-Trump Star Wars movie. Yeah. And I think, and maybe this was something that was still residing within the zeitgeist, that kind of positivity that, the Obama campaign tried to kind of cram through the consciousness back in 2008 and 2012. I think to a degree that was still there. But at the same time, the mainstreaming of, people acting like outright fascists hadn't really taken hold until the year Last Jedi came out. And it wasn't because of it. It was prior to it. I mean, Charlottesville happened that year. Mm-hmm. But then you saw the harassment and the bigotry geared towards Kelly Marie Tran, who played Rose Tico. And I understand the criticisms of how her character was written, the dialogue, whatever. That is fine. All film is subjective. But when they're going after her the way they did and the treatment she received, it's reprehensible and it's hypocritical, because I'm sure a lot of those people who went after her are saying, we don't want someone who's Asian in Star Wars. It's like, well, Star Wars is... That's the thing with the rebellion against the Empire.
It kind of spanned demographics, and I know that, you don't like these movies, but definitely the prequels, I think, had more, at least, racial representation. You know.
Yeah, well, with
To put it both bluntly and in both the most positive
within
light
the context
possible, so.
of the films, the Republic and the Rebellion, and to a broader extent now the Resistance, they are all seen as very diverse, and that, of course, it doesn't just apply to humans. Humans in the Star Wars universe, there's no racism. It's species, and it's speciesism, and so that's why in the Empire, somebody like Grand Admiral Thrawn is a rarity because he's an alien. He's got blue skin. He's got red eyes. Whereas everyone else in the Empire looks like you and me.
Right.
So it's kind of like that's the irony is that, again, it goes to the Obi-Wan line of like all these people who got bullied for so many years and then decided to take their hatred out on Rose, on Kelly Marie Tran. I know that Daisy Ridley had to turn off her social media for some of the hate she was getting. I remember doing a podcast at CSUN where I was talking with someone about the whole quote-unquote controversy with Finn being a stormtrooper. Right. And their argument was, oh, well, he shouldn't be black. He should look like Tamura Morrison, who played Jango Fett and then all the clones.
Well, see, that's the thing. You never saw what a stormtrooper looked like.
Exactly.
With their mask. So,
and
the ambiguity there lends to its mystique.
Exactly. And on top of that, in both, and this is something that the new canon took from Legends, the reason why you don't hear Jango Fett voices among the stormtroopers in the original trilogy, I mean, number one, Tamura Morrison wasn't the age that he was when they came out on DVD to do all those voices. He did do Boba Fett's voice. They kind of retroactively redid that, where they took out the original voice actor and put in Tamura Morrison. And I'm okay with it. I mean, it is what it is. But then the explanation is that the clone troopers died out because they had accelerated aging. Boba Fett did not. He was an unaltered clone. Attack the Clones. Facts, am I right? So that's why the clone troopers kind of die out or they retire. And some of them even join the rebellion because they basically turned off their the circuitry in their heads that made them execute Order 66. So I think that's something that, it seems like all the hardcore fans that were going after Finn didn't really take any of that into consideration. And that's where I come in as I was then a hardcore fan, and I look at him and I go, you call yourselves hardcore fans? Come on. Get real. Come on. What are you doing? So, but yeah, it's just the fandom. And I know that some of the fandom was very disappointed with Rise of Skywalker. I sympathize, but I also looked at the end of that movie with the end of the year it came out, 2019, as
you're done.
I'm done. Like it's like Luke in Last Jedi. I'm cutting myself off from the Force. Yeah, and I'm okay with that.
I don't think it's a bad thing to just necessarily stop there. If there is another Star Wars movie, which it's fucking Disney,
it's gonna happen.
Godspeed. But of course you're gonna watch it. But you're gonna go into.
I don't know though.
But you're gonna. Let's be real. You're gonna watch it. You're gonna go into it with a new perspective of I am not the diehard fan that I was.
Right.
And hell, it may even contribute more to your analyticism of that, where it's like I went to the movie, I watched it, I liked it. Would I watch it again? And you can look at it as simply as that, because at the end of the day, you are watching a movie. You're not digging as deep into the lore as you were before.
But it's, and I think because I've already had, if I include the Clone Wars movie and probably some animated film that was like straight to DVD back in the day, if I accommodate for all of that plus the two spin-off films that we got under this current regime, the thing is that even though none of those are episodic, it still adds to that feeling of oversaturation where I'm like, I feel like I got a little too much, a little too much in my drink.
Yeah.
So, but then on top of that, my defense of The Last Jedi, which I could get run out of town just for saying those words. Look, and this could be an episode of itself, but I'm going to leave that for another day.
I thought we were moving on.
We are. We're already at 10 and a half minutes, and I'm going to cut it before we reach 15, I promise. But when it comes to The Last Jedi, I think, again, Rian Johnson did reverse engineer Empire Strikes Back. But subverting expectations, treating Star Wars differently than I think how George Lucas would have treated it, how JJ was treating it. I mean, with JJ, we had a feeling after he did the first two Kelvin-verse Star Trek movies, as they're referred to,
right?
Or Kelvin timeline.
Kelvin timeline.
Like in that regard, like, okay, I know what I'm getting. With Rian Johnson, I've seen Looper, I've seen his Breaking Bad episodes. They're great. I love them. How is this going to hold up in terms of the pantheon of the other Star Wars films? And it was very simple in a lot of ways. It was intricate in a lot of ways. It was very small scale to a degree, which I kind of enjoyed. I'll admit, I'm like the majority of people, I didn't like the Canto Bight sequence, but everything else in the movie I ate up and I enjoyed it. And for a while I was watching the film, I wasn't so sure how I felt. I was feeling like, I don't know if this really holds up. But after rewatching it and realizing things like the sacrifice of Luke Skywalker, Kylo Ren's ascension to becoming the supreme leader of the First Order, the whole plot line that literally went nowhere. And when I mean it went nowhere, I mean it was a great plot line about Rey coming from nobody, being from nowhere, that completely got upended with, "You are a Palpatine." There was something there that was unique, but it still was a callback in that classic Star Wars way that was appreciative. And of course, having a cameo by Yoda was great. That was the moment. That was the moment in the movie where my subjectivity completely fell apart.
Yeah.
That was the moment I realized, okay, I do like this movie.
Fan service.
I know.
In a sense,
and granted, I was that way with Rogue One when I saw the droids. But I've since changed my views.
I feel like it's just kind of ubiquitous when it comes to any Star Wars EU-related thing. When it's like, reference to, even the prequels, like, it's a reference to that. It could be the worst.
But it wasn't ham-fisted in the prequels.
No.
It served a purpose.
It served a purpose.
Usually.
Usually in the prequels, yes. But I'm talking like anything EU-related, such as like Rogue One, Solo. Like even if it's like an origin story, like I said in last episode, it's not something directly showcased for Star Wars fans. The criteria is that you'd have to do at least a little bit of digging. Yeah, for it to be constituted as EU. I think that's a fairly fair definition of it.
But the casual fan typically won't do that because
that's
Star Wars is our movies.
Yes.
Why should I have to read a book or watch a TV show?
Oh, boo-hoo,
Well, and to be fair, like I'm thinking about the older fans that they remember May 1977.
They remember the movie for what it was. You'd think that since they grew up so die-hard, and maybe that they've kind of evened out casual. A little bit. Yeah. Evened out into the casual sphere. They'd think, I'm still interested in this series. I'm still going to look it up.
Yeah.
You'd think.
And plus with Last Jedi,
there can be common ground between them.
The cinematography was great, and I still think that they did what they were able to do in terms of reinventing Luke Skywalker in a way that I didn't expect, I didn't anticipate. And with a lot of movies, I know what to feel about with a lead character going into it. With Luke Skywalker, I had a rough idea, but I enjoyed every second of it because this is supposed to be a different Luke Skywalker from 30 years prior. And I respect that and I admire that because this is a guy who's got so much weight on his shoulders. And the fact that people were so upset that, he saved his father, why couldn't he save his nephew? And it's like, he was in a moment of complete distress when he's got literally the fate of the galaxy on his shoulders as, by that point in time, the last And he wasn't even the last properly trained Jedi. He was
Right.
the last half-assed trained Jedi. And he had a moment of humility and humanity. And that's something that the Jedi, they didn't have that compassion. They didn't have that feeling that ultimately was a part of what led to their downfall, was by being so close-minded and being so in their hubris. The Jedi,
The
yeah.
Jedi.
They couldn't sense that the Chancellor of the Galactic Republic was a Sith Lord that whole time. He was right in front of them. And
I
for
think
13
that- I
years,
think
they
that
didn't
just
know
sh- I
until they
think
got
that-
wiped out.
I think that just showcases the strength of,
Oh, yeah.
just
A Palpatine,
the
yeah.
Palpatine's acting.
Oh, of
And
course.
I'm not like acting as like an actor, but just acting as like a character. And it's like I said last week, how he was able to effectively play both sides of the aisle in this
Yeah.
Machiavellian trope.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that isn't overt, and I love it.
Right.
For the same reason how I love, in a weird kind of way, people who can just kind of like sacrifice that humility and humanity to achieve a result.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which is what Palpatine did in the end. He sacrificed both
You also have
to attain power.
these powerful Jedi that should be able to tell, like Mace Windu and Yoda and Obi-Wan, and yet they don't. Or even Anakin. I mean, Anakin was so scatterbrained when it comes to his abilities that, of course, he wouldn't have predicted it. Mm-hmm. But he was also a Jedi that, and I think this is kind of that weird trap that caused Anakin to fall to the dark side and caused Luke to have that moment of humanity, is that because they slipped, basically. They slipped and had a fall from grace. And I think...
Well, was it that they slipped, or was it that a past event kind of triggered that? With Anakin, I knew it started with his mom getting killed.
Right.
Luke...
With Luke, you could argue, yeah, because with his father, he's looking at his nephew and thinking, I've seen this before.
Right.
And he had a moment of just thinking, I thought I could stop it. Mm-hmm. And then, as he says in the movie, it passed like a fleeting memory, and I was left with shame. And he's just looking down, and he's got a lightsaber lit in his hand, and then he looks at Ben awake, terrified. And I think, and granted, there I go saying granted again, I know that these movies were kind of going for a soft reboot, per the recommendation of, and this is what the CEO Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, had said in his book, talking about George Lucas's old scripts and whatever. In a lot of ways, this is a soft reboot of the Anakin and Obi-Wan relationship falling apart. The difference being we don't really get that relationship other than it's familial. We know this is Luke Skywalker's nephew.
I definitely think that it's more fleshed out in that little quip of a scene than it is in the entire prequel trilogy.
Yeah, well,
and I mean you
it's-
can kind of attribute that to just the hokey dialogue and cheesy method acting that was on display. Like, you never did get that relationship of Anakin and Obi-Wan
No.
aside from just being mentor and apprentice. Like,
No.
like you got that on a base level.
Right.
But in that little quip, it's like, more so understanding who they are in relation to you, but like the power that they hold as well. And I mean, Obi-Wan didn't even realize that till the Battle of Mustafar. You are the chosen one.
Right.
You were sent to, that was... You could tell Obi-Wan understood, but he never had that dialogue with Anakin.
No.
Kind of thing. He never had, it was like father and son, but they never acted like father and son. Here it's uncle and nephew.
Yeah.
You cannot, the familiar relationship's already established.
Right.
And I think it works a lot better, to tell you the truth.
I do.
I think that was probably one of the more memorable scenes of...
And the fact that they played it
realization.
where Luke doesn't give the full story, kind of the way Obi-Wan didn't give the full story about what happened to Anakin, and then Kylo gives his story, and in a way Rey's getting kind of a simplification of what Luke got in that bridge between Empire and Return of the Jedi, where, or it's not even, it's from the whole original trilogy. Luke gets one story in the first film, then he gets another story in the second film, and so he has to go to a completely different resource, Yoda, to get the final answer. And in this case, we're now at the 20-minute mark. We'll close this off in just a moment.
10 minutes
literally
ago.
right at the second I caught it, where Rey finally gets the full story from Luke, and you can tell that he's kind of embarrassed that he didn't really give the full story. But at the same time, number one, he probably couldn't have predicted the whole Force Skype thing between Kylo and Rey. That's what I've heard other people refer to it.
Force Discord.
Oh yeah. And so Force WhatsApp. And so I think having even that element to it, and also with Last Jedi, there's a lot of aesthetic choices, including that storytelling, that's reminiscent of Japanese cinema that I enjoy.
Right.
And I think that's a callback to George Lucas's intentions with the very first Star Wars film, and having it kind of acknowledge Akira Kurosawa's work. That's something that I wish more Star Wars fans acknowledged it, they admitted it, and they accepted it and loved it, because I think that was something that Rian Johnson did that I don't think JJ did with either Force Awakens or Rise of Skywalker. And I think acknowledging that kind of that Japanese film history with the Rise of Skywalker, I mean, it boils down to everything from the relationship with Rey and Luke, and then Kylo thrown into the mix, the whole sequence in the throne room, the way the throne room looks. I mean, there's just too much there that's reminiscent of all that, and I feel that that's something that totally gets overlooked. And I just think it was a much more creative chance for Star Wars, that it looked like it was going to go into that direction going into 9, but with a change in directors and with a change in story, we ended up getting what we got, and that's life. And if you keep going, you'll make it to Mars.
Just waiting for the kicker. Okay, so if we can now effectively transition.
Yes.
Next topic.
Oh yeah. So this was something that caught my attention recently, mainly because I recognized the art, and this is artwork. It was an article from LA Taco. Shout out to them. My good friend Thomas Gallegos wrote a piece for him about what happened at LA Weekly. Check it out. But it's the headline is, after being deported, these Oaxacan muralists are back and now have a, quote, permanent show at MOLA, or the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. So yeah, this is a group of artists, a group of muralists that I've had the chance to see their work in the past. It's hard to explain. I mean, granted, this is there I go saying granted again. This is a...
Take a shot.
Yeah. This is something you'll be hearing, but this is something you'll also be seeing in terms of the artwork. You ought to see it. But I guess if anything with the artwork, it's meant to be very reflective of Latin American art, specifically from Oaxaca in Mexico, and then tying it in with Los Angeles.
Right. So it says that Oaxacan communities have been living, working, and setting up roots in Los Angeles since the 40s. Mm-hmm. And the migration from the Tlacolulokos de Valle Centro. My apologies, I'm from the motherland, and yet I can't even speak Spanish. Way to go, 3 years in high school. And being indigenous people, the Oaxacan communities help build a community in Santa Monica and West Los Angeles. And in 2020, Zapotecos have even deeper roots in LA and have influenced the Koreatown and parts of West LA, as much as the city has changed them as Zapotecan Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're beautiful. Like, second glance...
And
first
another
glance, it was like, wow.
Another part of that article, it's the paragraph right before it that kind of encapsulates when I got to see it. Pacific Standard Time LA was a citywide art series that took place in the summer of 2017, the summer of Latinx representation in art. After generations of relegated to staying in the back of the house in restaurants, decades of a generational divide, of separated families, language barriers, the struggle for identity, Oaxaca, Californian stories had center stage for the first time in the rotunda at LA's Central Library, which those will be pictures that I'll share on the Mars on Life Instagram page. That's something that with these murals, these in particular, that you'll be able to see down in Long Beach, it's something absolutely worth checking out. The artwork is very evocative of kind of LA culture, but also that Mexican influence that has permeated Southern California, dating all the way back to the 1800s. Some of the artwork is reflective of a lot of that, whether it's artwork that shows, somebody carrying a small ship or what looks like a small kind of galleon, or somebody being baptized by a monk wearing the old conquistador helmet while also holding the kind of billy club you would see a police officer use. Mm-hmm. You've got a lot of different characters that are all covered up in ink. They're all tatted.
Solo Dios perdona. That's one I know. Only God forgives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, essentially, the representation I feel is just like astounding. And this one line here that says, when the mural-based art collective famously had their visas revoked and confiscated by custom agents at San Francisco, the artists are still denied into the U.S. and their art stands tall and strong in Long Beach. The fact that it hasn't been defaced in any way, shape, or form, I feel like that just kind of at a loss for words, because it's just, with so much racial tension and divide now, you'd think that murals like these would realistically be destroyed.
Yeah.
It's just kind of amazing just how much influence and efficacy, the messages that these murals have.
Yeah, I think in a place like Los Angeles, this artwork, I think, is in pretty good hands in terms of being taken care of, being respected. I know that there's been a lot of different incidents over the last year or so of outdoor murals being defaced in some way. And I know that, Southern California is not without its divisions, of course. Right. But I think that this is the kind of artwork that is so well worth emphasizing, not only because of the weird, tumultuous, and very frustrating time we live in, but also it's just too evocative of the history and the culture of Southern California, and especially Los Angeles, and to an even larger degree, with Mexico. This is all history that is so connected, and yet it really has been only in the last few years, it feels like to me, that you're seeing a lot more and more of that become more public. And while, we don't live super close in and around places like downtown LA or southern Los Angeles, when we do see artwork like this, we marvel at it because this is the art that makes LA LA. And I think getting to see something like this, it really just shows how powerful artistic creativity in Southern California can be, or at least how artwork coming to Southern California can be, and how much it reflects the times we're living in, hence one of the core tenets of our show. It's artwork that just absolutely needs to be recognized. And I'm trying to remember, I should know this given that I have seen it, because I went to the Central Library in Los Angeles in downtown LA, and it was just mind-boggling getting to see it up close. It was also my first time at that library, so I was finally, it felt like a real sort of coming home in terms of the city that I was born in. And of course, people telling me that I wasn't from LA. I'm talking about you, Kenny. Love you, buddy.
I was born in Burbank. You categorize different cities, and then there's subcategorizations. So
that's true.
You have yours, I have mine. And
well, now, and you had read the paragraph about them having their visas revoked,
right,
and confiscated. Yeah, that's
second paragraph.
And I think that's kind of the shame and the upset when it comes to a story like this, is just the fact that, wrapping it in with the destructive political climate that we're in with, the current president and, a lot of the xenophobia in this country, that just further adds on to the necessity for art like this.
Yeah. I mean, the last statement even says borders may prevent the Tlacolulokos from physically being in the country, but no wall can stop their art from entering.
Yeah.
So I think short and sweet is really as most effective as it can be.
And we ought to give Aureli Morales a shout out. This is a phenomenal story by LA Taco. This is the kind of thing that we haven't stressed enough on artwork like this yet on the show. But it's definitely something that when we envision Los Angeles, when we think about how art is supposed to work in an oversaturated, commercialized world like it is today, this is one of those examples of what art really means.
Well, it's one of those examples that breaks the mold in a sense that it's not just paint on a wall, right?
Yeah.
So, like all art, and you could ring the subjectivity bell in my ear all you like about how it has to have a message, but given the history, and also kind of given the trials and tribulations and turmoil to even get it on the wall and to have it stay and to have that efficacy of audience efficacy, and interaction, I think it definitely stands out in regards to its place in Los Angeles.
Yeah. And even
it's almost sacred in a sense of how
it really is.
It's just not messed with.
Right.
And
on top of that, the fact that, this is Aureli interviews a professor from CSUN, Xochitl Flores Marcial, about how she ends up telling Aureli that at first she says that it was an attempt to represent indigenous languages to show that Zapotec is not one single language, but rather an entire language family. Within it, there are over 40 varieties of Zapotec that could never fit on any size canvas. I mean, the feat of something like that is what I find just too astonishing, just because coming from somebody with a history of learning about and advocating for indigenous rights in the Western Hemisphere, the loss of language is something that every indigenous group faces.
Well, that's what we were going in. That's what we were going into when it came to American Dirt, like the facelessness and sort of the ambiguity of, storytelling for one, but also representation in another. And again, it lends to that mystique. At least it does for me.
Okay.
When it comes down to her stating that there are over 40 varieties of Zapotec that can never fit on any one size canvas. That could imply that they're not done,
right?
And that's great.
Oh, it is. It's phenomenal. And I think too that, and she also adds on that in LA, if you're in the right restaurant at the right time, you will too. I think that was a sentence that followed another one. The term dialect, which is how many people, including some speakers of these indigenous language, has been used to devalue native languages and the speakers of these languages. And I think even with the term dialect, that's something that I've heard be argued in relation to, like, for example, the Lakota language and how there's the male dialect and the female dialect, which is just kind of contradicting what she says. But I know Russell Means, who was one of the leaders of the American Indian movement, that was one of his criticisms for Dances with Wolves, was how the Lakota language was used, where the men were speaking in the female dialect, and the men were speaking in the female dialect, and the women were also speaking in the female dialect. And so, I guess if anything, that just kind of shows the importance of how knowing those specifics are important.
Well, knowing those specifics are important.
And in this case, just using the term dialect is
up to a point of even
iffy.
Having it inundated in language. I mean, that's Spanish in a nutshell. You can't have something either that's one dialect or one or neutral for that matter. It's always masculine and feminine. So I think it's just kind of a very effective call to form of how it relates back then versus to how it is now.
Yeah.
And whether it be traditional Spain Spanish or like Mexican American Spanish, I would call it at least. At least that's like the popular terminology of it.
But it's gorgeous, and I'm trying to pull back up on my phone. I just had them the pictures that I took when I got to see them, and it was just so staggering getting to see it. I mean, when you're walking through that rotunda and you're seeing these huge murals, and people are wearing, it's so all over the place in terms of you'll have somebody wearing a bandana, sunglasses, but then also wielding an obsidian knife, like what you would see, an indigenous person holding, back in like the 1500s or whatever, or the 1400s.
Right.
And having the tattoos resembling what a lot of Southern California indigenous groups would tattoo themselves, and seeing that and reflected in people that are of Mexican heritage, but they're also representing Los Angeles, like the kind of Los Angeles that you would see more so today. It's such a clash of just about everything that makes Los Angeles such a metropolis and such a welcoming, fascinating, interesting place. And even though LA itself may not always be welcoming to everybody, you and I know that, it's definitely, it's something that, it's a fighting city. And I don't mean the city itself, I mean the people in the city. They're fighters. And I think this is artwork that, seeing it within the city, it's beautiful and it stands out, and it comes as a message to all the bigots out there that, they'll look at this and be like, oh, it's a bunch of, it's gang members. No, it's beautiful is what it is. And it's a culture you're never going to understand.
I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as possible when I kind of address this topic. And
oh, boy.
Introduce it. So, as we know, we like to look at various forms of media, and I kind of just wanted to analyze a recent documentary, or should I say mini documentary, or should I even say further, a trailer of a mini documentary that isn't even out yet. So we're talking about PragerU's own Fleeing California, hosted by Will Witt and a few others, some congressmen, some professors, and some other conservative pundits. Now, regardless of what you think of the platform itself, and kind of speaking from personal preference, I watched PragerU a fair amount when it wasn't so preachy and proselytizing, back when it was sort of the alternative outlet to an otherwise, oh, okay, well, this isn't something that you'd usually see on a college campus. And that's what they marketed their platform as. Interesting ideas, but a whole lot of generalities, at least what I've come to conclude from it, watching it now versus watching it back then.
And in dire need of fact-checking, just saying.
Right. So, again, I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as possible, because we're analyzing this this trailer pseudo mini documentary. It's not even out yet.
When did this come out again?
I'm sorry?
The trailer for this 13-minute piece of schlock?
This isn't even 13 minutes. It's supposed to be longer than that.
Oh, okay. Because I had
so
found something that was 13
minutes,
and I could barely make it through half. But
there's a mailing list. You put your email address on it. You're notified of when it's showcased.
No, thank you.
Well, I, for one, put my email on it because I kind of wanted to do a follow-up on it, because I know the gist of what's going to happen in this documentary. People are fleeing California because people hate liberal ideologies. That's the base of what they're going off of. That's been the base of what they're going off of.
That's why...
And I can't stand those fucking, Bible Belt parents or people on Facebook sharing the same dumbass posts about... Yes, political and societal fact from way back then. Oh, did you know the Democrats were supporters of the KKK? Yes, everyone fucking knows that, all right?
No, not necessarily.
I don't need to be reminded of it in order to drive a point home that isn't even related to the topic at hand. Why do we need to paint one party in such a negative light when it isn't even pertaining to the issue at hand? Right.
Well, it's people. Here's the thing: that with that 13-minute video, it's people that want to put down California over issues like homelessness and affordable housing. Okay, where's your solution for it? Because I don't see one, and that's something that has been brought to my attention with every Republican, including Republicans in California. Where is your solution? I don't see one.
The idyllic 1950s sort of. I don't even know how to characterize it other than the traditionalism is something to a point that I can kind of accept of, oh, it was ideal then, maybe it'll work now. No,
Right.
you can still
Well,
have you can still have elements of conservatism that aren't preachy, that are like, I like to save money, I like to do an honest job, and that isn't even necessarily like, what's the word? Independent of one party. You could cross the aisle with generalities such as this. Thing is, PragerU's stuck in their little bubble. And I think the problem that I have with this is that, given that our podcast is more so arts-oriented, fleeing California for the third time, I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as possible, because I'm trying to analyze this in a light of, hypothetically speaking, let's say the Republican dogma of leaving California actually works.
Right.
Okay, people go to different states. What does that necessarily mean for artists, right? And we mentioned it before, sort of in our conversations about it. The central hubs for art are on polar opposite ends of the country. Essentially, L.A., New York, right? So let's just say people make the exodus to different states, and let's just say conservative states, Texas. That's just one that comes to mind.
Parts of the South, parts of the Midwest.
Parts of the Midwest, where you want to talk about affordability and homelessness. There is none because there is no people, right?
Well, and the thing too that you got to remember is, in a state like Texas, a lot of those suburban.
Well, I'm talking about Midwest. Texas is sort of like the popular see lazy thing to do of, hey, I'm going to move here because, it aligns with my conservative beliefs and I can hang a flag in my yard without being shot.
Which is not entirely true
exactly.
from the Prager standpoint, only because Texas is a very purple state in a lot of ways. And that's because a lot of suburbs are Latin American families. It's just some certain areas where you get more of the affluent, rich white folks that are living in around the cities.
Right.
Even though some of the cities have Democratic leadership.
It's really easy to look rich when all you spent on your house was $20 and a sack of corn, because that's all it fucking costs out there.
But I
anyway,
think in terms of artwork...
So we're talking about it in the hypothetical sense that people do move to these different states. How is that art affected? Does it take on a more conservatist approach in order to meet that state's demand? Because obviously, having that artistic approach from California into, let's say, Texas or Arizona, more conservative in nature,
right,
you're not going to get a lot of support for it.
Well, I think there you go. You just nailed it on the head, because I think the people that wind up leaving from California to Texas or California to anywhere else in the country, a part of it is the gig economy that we're in. And I think, and I know friends personally who they went out of state to find journalism work.
Right.
I know that in terms of affordability, in terms of housing, income, what have you, it's just I need to get out of the state so I can find the right kind of job that fits for me. In terms of artwork, you also nailed it on the head when it comes to, you have New York and then you have L.A. Well, if you're an artist from anywhere in the country, those are the two places you want to go to, even at the risk of
I have two
running out of money
on that,
or
though.
Yeah.
My first perspective is, again, with the whole moving out of state, is that person willing to be that big fish in a little pond, essentially be the artist in a town that, doesn't necessarily showcase it? Is that the smart move to do? Right. Where, maybe there's little to no competition and you can set yourself ahead of the board. I know if I moved to Wyoming tomorrow, I'd most likely be the only fucking publisher in the entire state.
Right. Oh, it's okay. I feel like the only journalist where I live, and I have a town newspaper.
Or do you find yourself moving to those one of two cities at the risk of potentially over-expensive housing and just, taxed to the max kind of situation in order to be a part of the zeitgeist of art, And that's just kind of the trade-off. Like, do you want to be that big fish in a little pond or a small fish in a big pond with potentially more opportunities? No one's moving to the Midwest for opportunities that they've found, okay? When you have a hub, it's really hard to distance yourself from it. It's really hard to move away from it because you think, I'm going to go out and move and find work. there might not even be work out there.
Well, and you even have to think about people that are making art, and if they got something like, say, for example, the guys from Chapo Trap House, another podcast, a bunch of those guys are coming from the Midwest. Right. And they're for a while, their episodes...
So it's the opposite. They're coming into...
So it used to be that way.
Okay.
And then everyone basically got settled into New York City, and so now they're doing all their episodes together, usually.
Okay.
And I think that, granted, that's also, there I go saying granted again, that in itself is an example of just making it in terms of, finance.
Right.
Through Patreon. But when it comes down to, if you're say you're an art student at Cal Arts, you're going to be showing your artwork to a lot of different people with a lot of different styles.
But with the same maybe ideologies, maybe not.
Well,
because
that differs because you could run into the sort of run-of-the-mill,
but
bougie kind of LA artist, but then have somebody who's, a veteran who is, politics be damned, ideology be damned. I'm reflecting on my own experience in the military, projecting it on artwork, but also throwing in the philosophy of Albert Camus. Someone I mentioned last week. There was one artist at Cal Arts that I met, I think it was last year. His name was Diego Barrientos, and that was what a lot of his artwork was representative of.
Patriotism?
No, not even. No? It was very, in a lot of ways, the artwork was very, it was, black and white's the wrong term, more like black and gray, but like it had more, it had simplicity, but it also had depth to it in regards to the pressures of having been in the military, having known people that have died, but then coming back out of it and sort of getting back into society while also having, family who live outside of the country. And I think in terms of people leaving California, I don't see it being...
Do you see it being effective in certain circumstances versus artistic circumstances? I feel like when a lot of people move out of California, assuming they were born here, or New York, they move because they're settling. They move because they've come to the conclusion, and again, Will Witt, to some degree, speaks on this in the most marginalized merit,
right?
That people move out because of finances. They can't afford it.
Right.
That can be justified to some extent. However, I feel like if you're moving to a place with virtually nothing, are you really moving for the right reasons?
Yeah.
And I remember that there was a small segment where Senator Ted Cruz came on the documentary, and he said, when people move to Texas, what's the terminology? They're like livelihood, happiness, or whatever. Like their skyrockets up 40%.
Right. Their
standard of living.
Yeah,
their standard of living rises up 40%.
Usually at this time of day, I'm like wide awake, but I'm that matcha green tea from earlier must be. Well, and I think,
and granted, yes, because it's.
See, now you're saying granted.
Yes, it is a culture shock to essentially just uproot and move. And maybe be in a place where, you do feel more accepted because of, I believe in something different. But even then, if you're moving because you feel like your belief will be more respected and accepted to another state, that sounds kind of vapid and cowardly.
Well, I'll put it to you this way.
Like, even if you are, let's say, right of center or independent, maybe right of center, and you're living in California or New York.
Pro or crypto Nazi. Yeah.
The fact that
as Gore Vidal once said.
I would say the fact that you can't just live here, and as fucked up as your opinion is, you can say it. Article 1, free speech. The fact that you can't stay here and maybe defend that ground or defend your ideology, and you have to fucking move in order to, find that other bubble that you've been searching for.
Right.
Artistic or not, it's a, it's running away.
Well, I think too that with artwork,
I'm not saying you have to settle here.
Yeah,
But I'm
yeah.
saying that if you're moving for that reason,
Mm-hmm.
it's not the right reason.
I mean, I know that in a place like Texas, you can definitely have an element of an art. You can have an art world, a whole art hub in Texas. But, and I think this is what differentiates it between LA and New York, and in some ways you can throw in other places like parts of Arizona, parts of New Mexico,
Right.
into this equation, where the art scene, if you will, in Texas is a little bit more one note, I guess is the best way to put it. And this is just my personal opinion. I think that there's a lot of artwork there that it's very reflective of Texas culture. And when I mean, what do I mean by that?
Well, Texas culture akins more to like patriotism and the
But,
sort
like,
of independent, like the
The
frontier
cowboy,
independence,
exactly. The frontier, the cowboys,
which-
Texas Rangers.
which is again conservative in nature, in execution, in representation, and more so historical context.
Well, and it's considered a good
So-
era if you're a conservative,
Yeah.
but if you're just about everybody else,
If you're just about everybody else moving from California to, like, let's just say hypothetically, a liberal's moving from California to Texas, and they see that, there's still going to be disagreements. So, what is that solved? You know?
Well, and I think that's where if you're an artist who tends to be more liberal, then you got to evaluate your situation the best you can. Because if you're going to decide I'm going to go to Texas, you're going to be faced with some opposition, and your artwork, whatever that art may be, is going to face some kind of criticism for being outside of the norm. That's why a place like Los Angeles or New York is far more metropolitan in that regard. Because you can have something like the murals in a place like Los Angeles where it's tying in so much further, I think, than the kind of Western artwork that you would see in a place like Texas. And I think you're tapping into culture, history, oppressed culture, artwork that's reflective of today that also faces oppression to some degree, whether it's by local officials or local law enforcement. Whereas in Texas, if you're doing artwork on the Cowboys or whatever, they weren't oppressed.
You want to talk about
They were running around all over the place.
you want to talk about oversaturation,
Like,
And
so
you
think,
want to talk about poetic irony,
and I think that's it. Kind of ties in with the arts in general in terms of diversifying the arts. It's what the Academy always, the Motion Picture Academy always runs into that issue every time there's an award show, which is saying it's all about diversity, but then every nominee is a white male over 50. And I think that's something that you could tie in with artwork, where you can have those artists who have been doing turquoise art their whole lives in Texas, but then you can have a young woman from Cal Arts who's doing artwork that's unlike anything you've ever seen before, but it's also so evocative of the landscape and the history and the culture of Southern California, which is in itself so rich. And I think that that's something that totally gets overlooked, and that's why even museums have been doing this, of having their exhibits not only stay relevant, but also realizing, hey, wait a minute, we live in this very widespread area in terms of culture, history, diversity, whatever you want to call it. We need to acknowledge that history within Los Angeles. I know that, and I've mentioned this to a lot of friends, that I ended up visiting it twice. It was so impactful. The Gene Autry Museum of the American West. Now, a lot of the stuff that you would see in there is probably, some of it is stuff you would see back east in Texas. But you go there, and of course there's an emphasis on indigenous art. There's an emphasis on current indigenous artists whose artwork may not necessarily be totally evocative of what you would see, 200 years ago. But then you'll have something like the La Raza exhibit, which showcased the Chicano movement, as well as the La Raza newspaper that came out of the Chicano movement.
Right.
And that was something that was so riveting, because it was showing, and of course, for me as the journalist, it was kind of like this is something that I wish like CSUN knew
Right.
to send people to, and I want to say some did. But it's just about having more, and since then I've seen more and more exhibits there that do reflect the kind of changes in the landscape as well as how we look at the West, for example. And I don't mean the West like, Ben Shapiro and his, Athens and Jerusalem West BS. I mean the West like the American West and a lot of the negative fallout towards communities of color from westward expansion. Right. And I think getting to see that reflected in the Oaxacan artist murals, whether it's at the Autry, even just within LA. I mean, this is something we're going to be showcasing for as long as this show is in the ether.
Definitely.
And I think that it's something that, the idea that people would actually be leaving California and then taking their art with them, long story short, I think would be contradictory if they wanted their art to really be seen and well received. Because I think, if you're an artist, I'll put it this way. The people that I do know who have moved out of California, their business is not in the arts. It tends to be in security. I knew one person who he was a stay-at-home dad.
So menial 9 to 5?
Pretty much, yeah. But granted, these were nicer jobs,
it's not
too.
To take away from, sort of the severity or authenticity of these positions. It's just a matter of like, hey, people move for different reasons.
Of course,
and, given the choice, if, God forbid, California becomes either too expensive, I may find myself jumping ship as well, not necessarily out of choice, but more so out of if I want to continue to do what I love to do and also, eat, then you just kind of have to make that sacrifice. Though I think what a lot of sort of conservative pundits don't realize, and more so just to take away as like a final point, is that, when people move, they often bring their perspectives with them.
Yeah.
So when it comes to people, let's say, moving from one area to another because they think it's more favorable in terms of how they view the world politically or how they view art politically or business, or, God forbid, the choice to fucking carry a clip on your hip, not everyone moving in is going to think like, the idyllic, I keep saying idyllic, that's my granted, for this show, for this episode, the idyllic 1950s perspective of, hey, my family's moving to Texas, my wife is going to stay at home with our child, and I'm going to be the breadwinner. It's going to be suburbia.
That's the thing is that's part of the Make America Great Again mythology. That's total hogwash.
And I can understand keeping tradition to a point where it doesn't necessarily trounce everybody else's perspective. It's the roaring, which it did.
It's the Roaring 20s.
It's the Roaring 20s, but man, that next decade is gonna fuck you sideways.
Yeah, no.
If it keeps this up.
This mini Tuesday was, that's a whole different episode. And I think one other point I want to make before we get towards the end of the show here is, and this is kind of the thing that I've always thought with journalism too, is let's just keep it all local. And I think that's kind of the beauty of, it's the focus of our show, it's our drive, but it's also, I think, what makes Los Angeles and Southern California such a wondrous place to be in is the level of creativity from people that, they make, how do I put this? They're creating artwork that is so reflective of the land, and it's so reflective of the history and the culture and the dynamics, good and bad, today. And it's in such a capacity that it's staggering to me, but it's also so vivid. And I caught myself that time. And one day, we'll do an episode about like what is art, what we think of art, and
how do you both define it, argue it, and sort of just like categorize it.
Yeah.
And as much as again, as much as people want to ring the subjectivity bell of it's one of one. In essence, art is equal. It's on an equal playing ground. Again, episode for another time, but I have some opinions on that.
Yeah, and on top of that,
can't just make a blanket statement like that and expect me to just accept it.
What?
And I'm sure you have some opinions on that as well. But,
and I just think that if if you can have artwork that really captures the area that you're in, it's probably coming locally, or at least it's coming from something that's inspired by the landscape. I mean, you can have somebody who came out of California come to California and really change it for the better or for the worse. Just look at Richard Nixon. Oh no, Richard Nixon was, he's from California. But anyway, I don't know. I my views on PragerU.
I didn't want to look at this as a spurring debate. I wanted to look at this as what good in an applicatory manner and contextually, what good can you take from this, and what hypotheticals can you take from this in the artistic sphere? I think we delved into it pretty deeply.
Ideally, you want to be in and around those hubs of artistic genius. And that's what's so weird about like a place like Cal Arts is the fact that it's that far away from LA. It's in Santa Clarita.
It's in its own little bubble, which is ironic because you'd expect it to be in the heart of essentially what captures the artistic sphere. And
like the idea that Tim Burton was in Santa Clarita studying, filmmaking is
mind-boggling.
A little bit, yeah. But at the same time, that's cool because it's showing Cal Arts. It's no different from our school, CSUN. I always tell people, hey, our most popular alumni, Cheech Marin, and most people laugh at me. But it's like, hey, you know what? Sometimes you're dealt with what you're dealt with in terms of your schooling, in terms of who best represents your school, and who came before you. And you know what? Whether it's Cal Arts with Tim Burton or CSUN with Cheech Marin, those are two guys I'd be proud to have as fellow, graduates. Definitely. So, I guess to wrap that up, I kind of touched on it halfway through the show. You can find us on Instagram at Mars on Life Show. Same goes with Twitter. And then as it comes down to our personal Twitter accounts, you'll find me at Mancini RA. And then on Instagram, it's at Mancini Ryan.
And respectively for me, on Instagram, it's at Dr. Sebi. And on Twitter, it's at Dr._Sebi. They wouldn't let me do it one word. Middle school. Anyway. Or high school, yeah. So that's where you can find me as well. So with
Excellent.
That, I think until next time.
Yeah, until next time. And then, of course, as always, you've been listening to the intro and outro music is Space Explorers by Kevin MacLeod. And, this has been Mars on Life. Please tune in for our next episode, which will be coming just around the corner. And like I said earlier, if you keep on going, you'll make it to Mars. See you later.